curious, slightly incredulous. If you look deep inside Australia's Vocational Education and Training system, the national curriculum that dictates how millions of professionals are certified, you will find a shocking anomaly. It's right there in the official paperwork for the Certificate 4 in the greyhound racing industry. Students taking this course receive mandatory training on how to handle the trauma experienced by racing dogs undergoing adoption. Yet, across that entire national educational framework, social workers, early childhood educators, and aged care professionals receive zero mandated training on the lifelong trauma of human forced adoption. In 2012, former Prime Minister Julia Gillard delivered a landmark national apology to the victims of forced adoption. The government officially recognized the deep psychological devastation inflicted on hundreds of thousands of unmarried mothers and their forcibly removed children. But a formal apology spoken in Parliament carries no weight if the state's modern educational apparatus actively ignores the fallout. We are left with a regulatory framework that mandates strict trauma care for retired racing dogs, while keeping the professionals tasked with caring for human survivors completely in the dark. To understand how this educational void persists, we have to look at the paperwork that created the crisis in the first place. This is the case of Shane Buell, born Paul Allen Morley in 1972. His adoption was governed by what the Australian state called the clean break policy, an institutional drive to permanently sever a child from an unwed mother and immediately issue a new, quote-unquote, legitimate identity. The procedural velocity of Shane's file is staggering. Within exactly 35 days of his birth, the state had finalized his adoption and legally erased his origins. To bypass the need for a father's consent, the government paperwork notes that the birth father is overseas at present and does not know. The state found it highly convenient to label the father as absent and unknown. In reality, Shane's birth father was Mark Moffat, the highly visible, famous music producer behind the hit Yothu Yindi song, Treaty. These falsified records reveal a deliberate ideological system. The state engineered this process to permanently delete inconvenient family ties and strip unwed parents of their legal rights. Decades later, Shane Buell has spent years fighting to have forced adoption trauma legally recognized as a psychosocial disability within the national workforce curriculum. Without that curriculum update, an entire generation of care workers will remain blind to the specific needs of adoptees. But the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations and their associated Jobs and Skills Council use a tactic we can call bureaucratic absorption. When Shane submitted extensive legal evidence and lived experience to the council, they thanked him, took his highly specific human rights violation, and dumped it into a generalized pool of feedback from over 1,000 general industry stakeholders. The institution consumes the emotional and intellectual labor of the survivor to check a box for stakeholder engagement. They create the perfect illusion of consultation, while guaranteeing that the survivor's specific demands are never translated into binding policy. Realizing the curriculum councils were stalling, Shane escalated the issue. He argued that omitting adoption trauma from national training packages constitutes indirect discrimination under the Disability Discrimination Act. He took this legal argument directly to the Attorney General's department. The department replied that while the discrimination law exists, they lack the specific portfolio responsibility to enforce it regarding educational curriculum. They deflected the complaint to the Australian Human Rights Commission. The Human Rights Commission immediately dismissed the inquiry, claiming the issue sits outside their complaint handling powers. When Shane went back to the Attorney General's department for help, they claimed they have absolutely no statutory authority to review or direct the Human Rights Commission. The complaint is now caught in a spinning loop. The root of this deflection lies in how Australia legally fragments the human lifespan. The federal government has a National Children's Commissioner to handle the rights of minors up to age 18. But the trauma of forced separation lasts a lifetime, and there is no dedicated social justice commissioner authorized to manage cross-generational adult family separation. The Australian bureaucracy operates in highly protected silos. By design, no single agency has the complete jurisdiction to solve the problem, allowing every department to claim their hands are tied while the harm continues. The result of this bureaucratic stalling arrived with the official approval of the Workforce Report 2025. Despite years of explicit warnings and legal submissions, The Department of Employment and Workplace Relations released a national roadmap that entirely erases adoptees and forced adoption survivors from the future of the care economy. Shane took the fight to the absolute highest echelon of the federal government, delivering the evidence of systemic administrative failure directly to Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Armed with proof of falsified historical records and modern curriculum exclusion, the Prime Minister's office explicitly refuses to initiate a royal commission into the matter. The fight is now playing out through active statutory complaints filed with the Commonwealth Ombudsman and the National Audit Office, alongside a growing demand for the creation of a dedicated National Commissioner for Family Separation. These endless deferrals and jurisdictional loops represent the 1972 clean break theory reborn in a modern administrative suit. The Australian bureaucracy continues to fulfill its original purpose, the quiet, legal erasure of inconvenient people. A government can rewrite a human life with a single piece of paper. Take the 1972 adoption file of an infant named Paul Allen Morley. The documents governing his adoption appear routine on the surface, but a forensic look reveals contradictions. The paperwork shows the birth mother signed the legal consent to relinquish her child exactly 7 days after giving birth. Then there is the medical assessment. A handwritten doctor's note explicitly diagnoses the baby as, quote, only fit for fostering. Yet just days later, an official typed declaration clears him as completely fit for permanent adoption. These are not clerical errors. They are the fingerprints of a high-velocity institutional machine. In 1972, the system was designed to meet a massive demand for infants, prioritizing speed to sever biological ties as fast as possible. This specific adoption file functioned as a weapon. It was the exact instrument the state used to legally erase an infant's origins and forge a brand new identity. This practice was driven by the clean break theory, an ideology from the 60s and 70s that mandated total suppression of a child's birth identity. The state used this philosophy to justify coercive separations, rushing mothers through paperwork to hit institutional adoption quotas. Decades later, the Australian government formally acknowledged the damage. In 2012, Prime Minister Julia Gillard issued a national apology, recognizing the lifelong psychological and social devastation inflicted on mothers, fathers, and adoptees by these forced separations. That infant from the 1972 file grew up. His name is Shane Boel, and he became an advocate for survivors. You might expect the national apology settled the matter. Instead, Shane discovered that the same bureaucracy is currently fighting to erase his existence all over again. The historical practice of wiping away an identity did not end in the 1970s. It simply adapted, shifting from the legal erasure of the clean break era into a modern form of administrative silence. Shane's recent campaign targeted the foundation of Australia's social services workforce, the Vocational Education and Training System, or VET. He wanted them to recognize adoption trauma. The logic is straightforward. If the VET system is training the next generation of social workers, aged care professionals, and early childhood educators, those workers need specific literacy to handle the complex psychological trauma experienced by adoptees. An exhaustive review of the National Training Framework reveals the nature of the exclusion. Across the entire VET curriculum, the singular mandatory reference to adoption is located in a Certificate 4 for greyhound racing. The regulatory state enforces comprehensive mandatory educational standards governing the post-racing welfare and adoption of canines. Yet it maintains a policy vacuum regarding the lifelong psychosocial impacts of human family separation. This omission exposes a profound institutional trivialization. The curriculum ignores well-documented human rights abuse while meticulously regulating the exact same concept for dogs. When Shane flagged this omission, the paper trail began. The Australian Skills Quality Authority claimed they only regulate training providers, not the curriculum, and deflected his complaint to the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations, or DEWR. DEWR then delegated the issue to a newly formed Jobs and Skills Council called HumanAbility. This handoff initiated a multi-year cycle of delays, standardized responses, and deferred reviews. Shane escalated the issue with a specific legal argument. He pointed out that omitting complex post-traumatic stress and adoption trauma from training packages actively creates an unreasonable barrier. Under the Disability Discrimination Act, this constitutes indirect discrimination. If you map this legal challenge, it triggers a jurisdictional loop. The Attorney General's Department acknowledged the law, but claimed they couldn't enforce it, pointing shame to the Human Rights Commission. The Human Rights Commission then dismissed the claim, stating it fell outside their statutory powers. By continuously passing the responsibility to agencies that either cannot or will not act, this closed loop effectively insulates DEWR and HumanAbility from facing any legal consequences for exclusionary policies. Protected by this red tape, the bureaucracy finalized its work. DEWR officially approved and published the Workforce Report 2025. Despite 3 years of detailed evidentiary submissions, the finalized roadmap entirely erased forced adoption survivors. This is a textbook execution of bureaucratic absorption. The state uses the illusion of consultation to exhaust advocates, consuming their time and energy without ever altering the structural exclusion they are fighting against. To understand why this deflection is legally permitted, we have to look at the macro structure of Australia's human rights watchdogs. This diagram illustrates a human lifespan. The National Children's Commissioner plays a vital role in protecting kids, but its mandate officially terminates the moment a victim turns 18. This leaves adult survivors completely outside their protective jurisdiction. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner does address cross-generational trauma, but this vital mandate is rightfully exclusive to First Nations peoples. That leaves hundreds of thousands of non-Indigenous adult adoptees without a dedicated advocate. Finally, information and privacy commissioners exist to grant people access to their own data. But when survivors try to access their identity records, these commissioners are blocked by archaic, state-level adoption secrecy laws. Together, these fragmented, siloed mandates create an accountability vacuum. By splitting the human lifespan and jurisdiction into isolated pieces, the system ensures the lifelong trauma of adult survivors remains legally ignored. The proposed structural fix is the creation of a dedicated National Social Justice Commissioner for Family Separation and Reconnection. This specific office would serve as a centralized authority capable of cutting across fragmented state and federal jurisdictions. It would have the power to dismantle outdated secrecy laws and mandate lifelong, uncapped trauma support for all affected demographics. Without this structural change, the emotional theater of government apologies stands in harsh contrast to the cold reality of the bureaucracy. A national apology requires the state to actually stop the harm. If the government lacks a centralized mechanism to enforce inclusive policies in its education and welfare systems, the apology fails its most basic promise. Until a dedicated commissioner is established with the power to act, the Australian government isn't fixing the trauma of forced adoption. They are simply updating the paperwork.